Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this FIREX International Keynote webinar, Life After Grenfell, Tall Buildings and Regulatory Developments, sponsored by Baldwin Boxall and broadcast by Informa. I'm Jerry Dunphy, the Event Director of FIREX International, and I'll be your host for today's keynote webinar. This morning, we heard from the FIA, FPA, ASFP, and Fire Sector Federation about the impact of COVID-19 on the fire safety sector, and shortly, we'll be hearing two presentations about the current and future approaches to the impacts of the Grenfell fire, which undoubtedly is the biggest conversation in the UK fire profession. You'll be hearing keynote addresses this afternoon from Colin Todd, MBE, representing the Fire Industry Association, and Colin will deliver a presentation based around Life After Grenfell, a practitioner's view. Colin is then followed by Dr. Andrew Taylor, Technical Officer at the Association of Specialist Fire Protection, and Andrew will deliver insight into regulatory developments 2020 and beyond. After Colin's and Andrew's presentations, we will host a Q&A session to explore and reflect on the points raised, where you can put questions to Colin and Andrew via the Q&A button on your toolbar. This is a topic which lends itself to much discussion, so please make full use of the Q&A function. This webinar is designed to be interactive. The row of buttons at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media outlets, participate in our survey, and engage in the Q&A session, which takes place at the end of the presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event, and you may also download a copy of these slides via the resources widget. We also recommend that you view this webinar via the Google Chrome browser. Lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please click the Help widget found at the bottom of your screen, or type your issue into the Q&A area, and we'll be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. So now, on to the first presentation, which is Life After Grenfell, a practitioner's view, delivered by Colin Todd, MBE from the FIA. Over to you, Colin. You now have control of the slides. Hi, everyone. We're just checking with Colin. There may be slight difficulty with his connection, so hold on a second, please.
Sorry, am I with you now?
You are indeed, Colin. Fire away. You're broadcasting out there.
Okay, I apologise for that, and so I'll begin again. Good afternoon, everybody. I've been asked to speak to you about life after Grenfell from the view of a fire safety practitioner. And if everyone will indulge me a little bit, I want to start off with something of a personal view, and then as we proceed, I will talk about the Fire Industry Association position and activities. And if what I say during some of the presentation seems a little negative, I hope towards the end to look to the future and give a more positive outlook for the future. So I hope people will bear with me until I get to that point. I'm aware that many of the delegates here today are themselves practitioners, and I say to them, life post-Grenfell in the fire safety sector, well, it's not great, is it? There's almost a sort of madness and rush for change I'd like to say the lunatics are running the asylum, but it's worse than that. The asylum is being run by politicians with political agendas to pursue, and the fast streamer civil servants who do their bidding, who last week were sorting out your income tax policy, but nowadays are sorting out fire policy. That's kind of scary. I want to begin, though, with a quotation. And again, I hope you'll bear with me. It's quite a long quotation, but I intend to reflect on this quotation during the course of this short presentation. And so I intend to read it in full, and I would ask you to perhaps ponder some of the messages that it contains. And the quotation is that a ratchet which serves to increase fire safety provisions rather than otherwise is the rare but significant occurrence of major fires. Public attention is attracted quite rightly to any kind of tragedy which causes multiple deaths. Public tolerance of such incidents is low, and I would say rightly low, even where on a statistical basis the risk to any individual of becoming involved in such an event may be extremely small. As a result, major fires are the subject of intensive investigation and analysis, and I think we would all say, again, rightly so. The outcome of such studies is generally to identify the major contributory factors which led to the incident becoming as serious as it did. The investigation is likely to be conducted on several levels, concerned with details of the initiation and communication about the event, the behaviour of survivors, victims and firefighters, and theoretical and possibly experimental studies of fire and smoke behaviour. The results of all of these studies are likely to emerge as a set of recommendations for improvement. Is this resonating, I wonder, a little bit? In an attempt to ensure that such an incident could not be repeated. The problem is that the results are unlikely to be formulated as a series of alternatives, the implementation of any one of which would have avoided the tragedy, but rather as a set of measures which must be adopted as a whole. This approach, whilst very well intentioned, leads to new sets of golden rules because of a failure of rational analysis. Was that the commentary on the post-Grenfell era? Well, no, it wasn't. It comes from a paper produced as long ago as 1994. It's an excellent paper if anyone's never read it. It's quite an entertaining and interesting paper to read. It's extraordinarily well written, and it's called Magic Numbers and Golden Rules by Professor Margaret Law and Paula Beaver. Most people will know the name of Margaret Law if they've been in the fire safety world for any length of time. She was originally employed at the government's then Fire Research Station. She ultimately went to ARUPS. I tend to think of her as one of the founding mothers of modern fire engineering. I worked quite closely with her on committees at a time we were trying to achieve recognition by the Engineering Council of fire engineering as a legitimate engineering discipline, which ultimately we managed to achieve through the Institution of Fire Engineers and their license to register fire engineers, not just at chartered engineer level, but also at incorporated engineer and engineering technician. So this paper came from the proceedings of the 4th International Symposium on Fire Safety Science. Afterwards, what Margaret said about it was presented to an audience that was predominantly made up of researchers who generally felt that they ought to be interested in the work of practitioners, but in reality are not. And in terms of talking about rational analysis, Margaret brought forth the baby in the Buick. And at the time, people were talking about fire resistance of car park construction. The structural elements of car parks ought to be greatly increased. Again, there's nothing new in this world, is there? That's another point I'll come back to. There's nothing new in this world. And so she drew this little cartoon, and there's the baby. It was said that people left their children in their cars when they went shopping. I'm not sure that's quite legal, but that was the justification for increasing the elements of structure of car parks. And so Margaret drew the baby in the Buick, the car's on fire, and the baby's unsafe, manifestly unsafe, because there's only half-hour fire resistance of the structure. Up it to 4 hours, and now the baby's safe. And I think she made the point very well. So what I'd ask people is a few rhetorical questions on which I wonder if you might like to ponder. What would Margaret Law think about the move back to prescription? And if you want evidence that there is a move back towards prescription, just look at Regulation 7 of the building regulations and its requirements on external wall construction. Incidentally, when I talked about all the rush to change, I am talking about England and the rush and the kind of madness that we see is inversely proportional to the square of the distance that you are from Westminster MHCLG headquarters and the Home Office. I'd like to tell you that in the wake of Grenfell Tower, Scottish building regulations didn't change by one word, but they did. They changed by one word. There was one word deleted from the Scottish building regulations. That's Scotland's response in terms of building regulations to the Grenfell Tower tragedy. Now, to give you the whole picture, the technical handbooks in Scotland, that's the equivalent of approved document B in England, have been changed very positively to specify from the 1st of October last year that high-rise blocks of flats should have evacuation alert systems for use by the Fire and Rescue Service. For compliance with the Building Scotland regulations, they should have floor numbers and flat numbers to assist the Fire and Rescue Service. And just to be even-handed about it, there is a little bit of madness because on the basis of a political decision, not a technical decision, but a political decision, all high-rise blocks of flats in Scotland will now need 2 stairways. So it's not all perfect in Scotland. I also wonder what Professor Law might think about the so-called clarification of approved document B. There we have approved document B before. Do not adjust your screens. I worked very hard to make the after version somewhat distorted. But the clarification was very stringently restricted such that it was not to include any technical changes. The brief for the clarification that was deemed to be required was that nothing was to change. And indeed, we read in approved document B, there are no changes from the previous edition to the technical guidance within approved document B. There are no changes. Really? So where did balconies come from all of a sudden that were surreptitiously included, and somewhat disingenuously, I would suggest to you, because balconies previously, in the so-called unclear version, well, they weren't referred to at all, other than in relation to their fire performance if they were part of means of escape. But in the clarified version, which remember doesn't have any changes, we read about balconies being an attachment that has to be considered in terms of compliance with requirement B41, that the external wall construction must resist the spread of fire over the wall. So where did that come from? I wonder what Professor Law might think about the Hackett report and the hair shirt of the fire sector, because Dame Judith berated everybody in the construction industry, the fire industry, the building control sector, anybody who'd really gone into a building virtually, and it was all everybody's fault, and everybody was prepared to stand by and say, yeah, lovely, lovely new clothes, Dame Judith. We've all been very, very bad, and we're all going to get very much better. And she did an excellent job in assimilating an understanding of the fire and building control sector under huge pressure very quickly. And much of what she has to say makes perfect sense. But then nobody seems to want to challenge the things that actually don't make perfect sense. And the response of government is interesting, which is, let's throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's building control. You can see on the slide the building control regime being thrown away, or the oversight of it being thrown away. But remember, there's nothing new in this world. We've seen this before. Some of us would be old enough to remember Piper Alpha. And after Piper Alpha, it was deemed that the Department of Energy, who were responsible for fire safety on offshore rigs, were underfunded, under-resourced, and had a conflict of interest. Does that resonate with building control? Underfunded, under-resourced, and conflict of interest? Well, Dame Judith says there's a conflict of interest with approved inspectors, and many of us would probably agree with that wholeheartedly. So what's the answer? Is it to fund and resource the Department of Energy? No. Get rid of the Department of Energy. Bring in the HSE. Nothing new in this world. I wonder what you'd think about Phase 1, the Phase 1 report of the Grenfell Tower Public Inquiry. I don't want to say very much about that. Then what about the fire sector themselves? What do we think about the Home Office solution to the problem? The Home Office solution to the problem is, of course, as everybody knows, the new Fire Safety Bill. So here's a kind of overview. And in giving this overview, I think I do speak for the Fire Risk Assessment Council of the Fire Industry Association. And the overview seems to us to be this, that the construction industry lets the country down. Multiple hundreds of buildings with external wall construction and cladding that does not meet the functional requirement of the building regulations. The construction industry feigns ignorance and blames government. It's all unclear. It's all in ADB. Can't understand that. I wonder how many of us today can recollect the building regulations prior to 1985. Because I will put my hands up to it, probably would never admitted this publicly before, but I never understood the building regulations until 1985. And approved document B and the functional form of the building regulations that came along in 1985 was a breath of fresh air for us all. Suddenly it all became terribly clear. It became really simple, very well explained in approved document B, but it's not intended for lawyers. It's not intended to be Janet and John builds a tower block. It's intended for construction professionals who apparently found it all too difficult. And then building control. Well, here's again the sort of summary of the government position. Construction industry lets the country down. Building control fail adequately to apply the building regulations. Before the Building Control Alliance send me hate mail, that chap is asleep, not because he was out on the tiles last night or because he was lazy, but because he had too much work to do and couldn't really cope with it. And so what's the solution? Of course, dump the legacy problem on fire risk assessors. Now, I describe it as a legacy problem because in the brave new world post-Hackett, it's all going to be great because the HSE are coming along. I'm not quite sure what the HSE are going to bring to the table and what expertise they can offer people, but maybe I should keep an open mind. But remember, there's nothing new. So dump the problem on the fire risk assessors because it's only a legacy problem. Everything's going to get much better, but we have a legacy of buildings that were not adequately constructed in accordance with the building regulations. Give it to the fire risk assessors. Let them sort it out. Or if you don't give it to the fire risk assessors, give it to the fire engineers. It must be their fault as well that we have all this problem. Is it? Because fire engineers doing fire engineering solutions would rarely have worried themselves about external wall construction. Look at any strategy report prepared by fire engineers. It does not wax lyrical with fancy CFD calculations on external wall construction, because there probably isn't a fire engineering solution as such for compliance with requirement B41 about external wall construction. But the answer is, yeah, get a chartered fire engineer. That's the answer. But how's this chartered fire engineer meant to sort it out? How is he meant to sample? How many samples does he take? What does he actually do in this sampling process? How does he actually assess the risk? But hey, he's a chartered fire engineer. If the fire risk assessor can't sort it out, well, the fire engineer will, and dump it on the fire and rescue service, because they'll have to go along and audit this compliance with the fire safety order in relation to external wall construction. Funny, they've never had to do that before. Bearing in mind that the fire safety bill is supposed only to be clarification. So there we are. We clarify the fire safety order. Is it clarification or is it an extension of scope? If it's an extension of scope, that's probably open to judicial review because it was never subject to any proper consultation. But call it clarification, and you don't need to consult because you're clarifying something that already exists. But you can drive a coach and horses through the concept of clarification. If it's only clarification and external wall construction was always within the scope of the fire safety order, and it's just we were all too thick to understand this, why did the fire authorities never have external wall construction in the scope of their audits, or even the audit pro forma? And there are plans possibly to bring the Fire Safety Act, as it will become, bring it in phases. How can you bring clarification in phases? You can bring an extension of scope in phases, but how can you bring clarification in phases? Because clarification is digital. Either it's clear or it's not clear. It's a bit like saying people are too stupid to understand that they have to check the tread on the tyres of their car. So let's bring in legislation that clarifies that people need to check the treads on the tyres of their vehicles. But we'll only make it HGVs this year. We'll leave the private cars, well, that will be unclear still for a while. It doesn't make sense. Defies all logic. Now, in terms of the FIA, and I did say I'd speak about the FIA position. The FIA position is that appraisal of external wall construction is not within the competence of most competent fire risk assessors. This is not a matter of them needing upskilled or them having been incompetent. This is way outside the scope of a fire risk assessor to look at the external wall construction. Sometimes you need an architect, sometimes you need a building surveyor, sometimes, as government guidance in the consolidated advice notes suggests, sometimes you might need a fire engineer. But I can tell you on behalf of the FIA that the board of the FIA have approved publication of a new guidance note for fire risk assessors. It will become live probably by the end of the month. And it does three things. First of all, it rejects any assertion that external wall construction is in the scope of the fire safety order as it stands at present, or therefore within the scope of fire risk assessments carried out thereunder. Now, if that's wrong, there's an estimated 500,000 fire risk assessments, but probably more, for blocks of flats that are not suitable and sufficient. Is that really credible? Secondly, the guidance note advises fire risk assessors to exclude external wall construction from fire risk assessments unless they have some specialist competence in that respect. One certification body reckons that will be less than 10% of fire risk assessors within third-party certificated companies who are deemed to be absolutely competent at carrying out fire risk assessments but do not consider external wall construction. Thirdly, it will provide an exclusion clause which will be scrutinised by legal counsel, and that's happening right at this moment. And the wording of the exclusion clause will be recommended to fire risk assessors as for inclusion in all fire risk assessments. And it will recognise that this is a different discipline and it might need a recommendation in every fire risk assessment. Have your external wall construction inspected by others. We see an analogy in that respect with asbestos. And perhaps what's needed, in the same way as every building has an asbestos register if it was built before the year, I think it's 2000, but after that asbestos was banned, so you don't need to worry about the asbestos register. There will become a point when, in the brave new world post-Hackett, you don't need to worry about external wall construction. But for those built before the brave new world, perhaps what's needed is a one-off appraisal by specialists of the external wall construction so that you have a register, an external wall register. And in the same way as the health and safety practitioner checks that there has been an asbestos survey and there is an asbestos register, the fire risk assessor would check that there has been this one-off external wall appraisal and there is an external wall register. That is our solution, because the FIA position is that we do not want the public exposed to risk because of a legacy of buildings with inadequate external wall construction. And our view is anything that can be done to reduce that risk to the public, more power to the elbow of government in achieving that, and the FIA stand ready to support government in any initiatives in that respect, other than dumping the whole problem on fire risk assessors. Another possible solution for the future, I just mentioned the organisers, so I'm coming towards the end. I think I've got about 5 minutes left. Another possible solution for the future, still ending on a sort of positive note, might be a new publicly available specification. We've got PAS 79 that kind of came to the rescue in 2005 when people were required to carry out fire risk assessments, but there was no real standard or consistency as to how to go about it. What about a PAS that would support the extension of scope, and that's what I'm calling it, of the fire safety order, such that, yes, external wall construction does need to be looked at by someone, very important, but it would establish, a separate PAS would establish this as a separate process from the fire risk assessment. It would probably ease the PI insurance problem that everyone has in relation to looking at external wall construction, because it would calm the insurers down a little bit that those carrying out these appraisals are following a recognised industry standard. It might ease the EWS1 problem. I haven't got time to go into that, but everybody knows what that problem is. It would provide a greater cohort of those prepared to carry out the work, because possibly easing in PI cover, but also those who are a bit nervous about doing it, but probably have the competence, would have an industry standard to work to, so would be prepared to do it. So that would be to the benefit of the public. It would provide consistency in these appraisals, and it would consider residential buildings of all height, because nothing magic. We agree with the consolidated advice note. Nothing magic happens at 18 metres. It's a historical figure based on wheeled escapes and is now just an arbitrary number of no significance. Last slide, competence. Competence is a big issue. Everybody wants to talk about competence, and possibly rightly so. We should capitalise on that. The time has never been better for upskilling of all aspects, all sectors within the broader fire sector, and recognition of competence. How? Third-party certification. The FIA are particularly strong in their support of third-party certification. I suspect not all delegates know, but member companies of the FIA are not simply people who paid their money and joined a trade association. Membership is contingent on the company being third-party certification, so that if a member of the public buys the services of an FIA member, they're not just paying somebody who has themselves paid money to a trade association. They are buying people who will, by warranty almost, be third-party certificated. And my very last point on looking to the future and looking to a brighter future, perhaps, it really emanates from a second hat that I wear as chairman of the IFE panel that registers fire risk assessors as competent to carry out fire risk assessments. It is not yet common knowledge, but neither is it confidential, that the IFE position is to move towards a situation in which all fire risk assessors on the IFE register are actually registered engineers, qualified engineers, via the Engineering Council at engineering technician level. This is not terribly difficult for competent fire risk assessors. Older fire risk assessors who did the old station officers examination in the fire service, well, that is the academic qualification for Eng Tech. And that's not IFE looking after their pals. That is the view of the Engineering Council, having looked at the engineering content of the old station officers exam. For those who didn't do that, then there are other routes. There are personal routes where the person's individual experience and qualifications are looked at on an individual basis. And so this is not a barrier. It's not a huge barrier for people being registered as competent fire risk assessors. But what we do want, we understand that the public need reassurance, third-party reassurance, that those on the IFE register are qualified to do the task. And the IFE answer to that is yes, they will be qualified engineering technicians. A brighter future, hopefully, for the whole sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Colin. That was quite superb. Really interesting points you've raised. Great to hear as well the underpinning as well of the FIA membership requirement, sort of third-party approval. I think that really needs to be brought out all the time. So the fact that, you know, when you do use FIA companies, they do have that level of competency, which is really important, I think, where life safety is concerned. Some of the points you raised, highly thought-provoking as ever, particularly things around the clarification of approved document B. That always is a bit of a question. The sector and government responses to the Hackett report, really interesting as well. The application of building control regulations, and my personal favourite actually was the baby in the Buick illustration. I thought that was excellent. So I'm going to print that out and put it on the wall somewhere. So fantastic. So now it's a great pleasure for us to welcome Dr. Andrew Taylor, who's the Technical Officer from the Association of Specialist Fire Protection, ASFP. So over to you, Andrew, and you now have control of the slides.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much. So for those of you that don't know me, and I'm Andrew Taylor. I'm the Technical Officer at ASFP, which is the trade association for passive fire protection manufacturers, installers, test and certification bodies. And basically my aim today was to give you some background on the regulatory changes that we see coming in the next 12 to 24 months and beyond. I don't actually think that in this, for our market, we've seen the regulatory landscape moving as quick as it is doing at the moment. And there's an awful lot of potential changes, as you can see from this slide, that are going to happen over the next few years. I'm not going to talk about the second one on the list there, the Fire Safety Bill, because Colin's just done that excellently and far better than I can, and what's going on with that. I was going to talk more about the Building Safety Bill, which it's a bit like taking a bit of a guess, because we haven't seen the draft text of that. It's just the information that we're getting already from government in planning for that document. And then beyond that, we've also got, of course, the implications of Brexit and the trade negotiations of that, and the fact that the European Commission is still reviewing construction product regulations. And all of that has an impact on where we see these things going for passive fire protection construction products going forwards. So, if we consider where have we got to where we are today? And of course, Colin mentioned Dame Judith Hackett and the Building a Safer Future report that she produced in May 2018. She looked at building regulations, she looked at fire safety, she made 53 recommendations in her report of May 2018, and government says, yes, we'll accept all of them, and what's more, we're going to go further in certain areas. And of course, that's one where Dame Judith said she hadn't mandated banning combustible materials from external walls, which government did. She wanted to concentrate on fixing the construction system, and she got quite a bit of flack for that. And of course, that ban has been reviewed since, and there's a consultation out that closes on Monday, looking at the implications of that ban. Right. In summer 2019, government took the Building Safety Bill consultation. They went out, they asked over 120 questions on it, and they got 870 responses, which is why it's taken them pretty much until April 2020 to get a response, to take all those responses to those questions and come up with an outcome. And those outcomes are going to be used to publish a building safety bill. Now, we've already had some things that we know are in the building safety bill because it's been sort of forewarned to us. It was mentioned in the Queen's speech as Parliament restarted in December, and we already know that, as Colin said, nothing's new. The National Building Safety Regulator is going to move under the auspices of HSE. And what we also have been told from government last month is that that's going to go live before the bill comes into force. And the terminology that we get there is shadow regulator. So HSE is going to take some responses, and of course, this is going to be it's sort of new area, if not exactly a new thing for HSE. And there's a whole host of things that this new National Building Safety Regulator is going to be doing. They're going to be doing some stuff on all buildings, right? They've sort of got a role to oversee safety and performance and to promote competence of those working on all buildings. But they've got an awful lot of responsibility for high-risk buildings. We refer to things as buildings in scope, and what is and buildings in scope of high risk. And if you look at the list of things that they're doing for high-risk buildings, then there's a whole lot of stuff there in terms of oversight of building control. They're going to have a register of all these buildings in scope. They're going to be responsible for reviewing the construction process of new high-risk buildings and signing it off at the gateway stages. And there's going to be a safety case for those buildings. And again, nothing's new. The safety cases were the types of documentation that the offshore oil industry brought in after Piper Alpha. So this is all building on what Colin was saying. This is all new stuff that we see for the Building Safety Regulator. They'll be doing some work to help review the approved documents and ultimately could replace BRAC. And there's also a list of those competent to work on in-scope buildings. Now, one of the things I keep talking about here is what is an in-scope building? What is a high-risk building? And as we say, at the moment, we know that buildings in scope initially is going to be based on this crude arbiter of 18 metres or 6 stories. But we have been told, we had a consultation in January that a lot of people filled in and said, what do you think about where do we draw the line for high-risk buildings? And is height the pure arbiter? And most people fed back and said, no, height's one thing, but it's very crude. And government has said that there will be a new risk-based approach, including other factors as well as height, that will come out within the Building Safety Bill, if not before, to identify what's in scope. Okay. Another point which is definitely worth making is a word on safety cases. And one of the things that we've been told, Dame Judith did a couple of webinars earlier in the month, and one of the things that she came out with, that safety cases are going to apply to all in-scope buildings. Okay, so obviously the safety case is going to need to be done retrospectively for existing in-scope buildings. And one of the key question for your safety case is going to be, is the building safe to occupy? And she made a couple of points going forwards. One is that within new builds and within maintenance work, your supply chains are going to have to get an awful lot better within the Regulation 38 side of things, so that you know what's in there and you know to prove information that the products and materials and systems installed in your building are safe. And you will need to know that not knowing what's in your existing structures is not going to be permissible as an excuse. So there's an awful lot of new stuff there that we can see coming, and it's going to have quite a significant impact on not just the new buildings and new construction, but also on existing buildings. But that's not all that's in the Building Safety Bill. There's also a whole series of new stuff on construction products regulations in the UK. We're going to have a new construction products regulator doing market surveillance, looking at enforcement actions on manufacturers and advising industry and government, and a new product standards committee. Okay. Now, as it stands, what this will do is it's going to take on board the existing mandatory product standards we have which were mandatory under the European construction products before the end of last year, and it's going to advise, and they're looking into considering whether stuff that at the moment has a voluntary product standard should become a mandatory UK regulatory position. Okay? And that actually affects an awful lot of our systems. It affects an awful lot of passive fire protection systems, because at the moment most of our materials are voluntary markings, and we hope that we've long wanted to get to a position where we have a mandatory system, and this could be one way where we get there. So that's actually something that we as a trade association have to put an awful lot of focus on, to make sure that this new work that's being undertaken by the government goes in the right direction. Now, one area where quite often we get confused and we see confusion, and certainly it's an area where I think that sometimes politicians get confused, is what is standards, what is regulations. And I just thought one of the things I'd explain here just before we go any further is, right, if you look at this simple little flow chart at the moment, we take a product and we test it to determine its performance, and those are done to test standards. We look at a classification standard which tells us how to then take that test evidence and interpret it in terms of whether it gives us 60 minutes performance, 90 minutes performance, 2 hours performance. A product standard is a list of requirements that explains how the product works and its likely lifetime and its performance, and how it's affected by its performance and durability. And it also contains information about the quality controls and the quality methods you need to make sure that product remains the same as manufactured today, as it was when it was tested back when. And all of those feed together into the construction products regulations, and the product regulations legally says how we have to do. And quite often we see these issues being confused, and the word standards is used to mean regulations. Okay? And who sets these laws historically? Up until the 31st of January this year, the construction products regulations was a piece of law that had come through from the European Parliament. So the European Commission was responsible for dealing with that. And in terms of passive fire protection products, The test standards and the classification standards were written by SEN, the European Standards Organisation, of which BSI is a member, and the product standards were either written by SEN or by IOTA, depends whether it was a mandatory system by SEN or a voluntary system by IOTA. And of course, SEN and IOTAs were controlled by, doing that was controlled by the Commission. They would take instructions from the Commission. And so you can see that there's a system there. And of course, as of the 31st of January, in terms of the UK, that changed because of Brexit. But it's probably worth mentioning reminding you that from our standpoint, from PFP standpoint, we were working via the IOTA route with a voluntary product standard. We always wanted a mandatory standard through the SEN route, but we've been really struggling over 10, 15 years to get that to come to fruition through the European Commission. Okay, so if we look at our relationships with all of those various bodies today, we know that in BSI is a SEN member confirmed until the 31st of December this year, and the BSI position is that they want to stay involved in international standards, including European standards, and had feedback from BSI earlier this week that they're looking to extend that 31st of December this year to next year and put the necessary statute actions in place so that they can remain a member of SEN thereafter. That, interestingly, that 31st of December for BSI isn't necessarily related to the end of the transition period. That date was written in the calendar long before January's events and the UK leaving in January and the transition period being set at the 31st of December. IOTA, well, again, UK is a member confirmed to 31st of December this year, but that is as part of the current transition periods, and there's no plans thereafter, and we're waiting to hear what happens with the trade deal. We know that European technical assessments on the IOTA website will stay there after the 31st of December, even if it's from a UK notified body. But if any new ETAs wanted by UK manufacturers after the 31st of December will need to go through an EU tab, an EU assessment body. And finally, we know that the Commission's already denying UK notified bodies access to various Commission-organised committees, and that's because we effectively left the European Union as of the 31st of January, and we're also told that the UK government's planning for regulatory divergence. So if we come back to our four types of standards and regulations, what do we think might happen to these? So really this one's self-explanatory. For the test standards and the classification standards, there's pretty much two scenarios. BSI remains a member of SEN. The actions that are in place follow through on that. So we're able to keep the current BSEN test standards that we have in force. And the moves that the UK government's made with building regulations from the old BS 476 towards the BSEN 13501 series, we know that transition has been happening slowly over time, and that will continue. And who knows? Eventually, maybe even BS 476 will wither and die, and we'll continue with the current the BSEN standards. Of course, the converse could be that if BSI loses SEN membership due to its trade negotiations, due to the trade negotiations and something happening, then all bets are off. BS 476 could make a comeback, or we could be working more with ISO rather than BS 476. But at the moment, if I was placing a bet, I would say that the top condition remains the most likely outcome, and that we remain members of SEN. Certainly, SEN are keen to keep us because BSI is one of the key standards-making organisations that comprises SEN. Okay. In terms of construction product regulations, we know that the construction product regs was one of the EU laws that passed into UK law as of the 31st of January when we left. We know that and that's doing things like making changes like changing the words European Commission out and putting UK in. But that's there, it's now a UK Act of Parliament. Where harmonised ENs exist, it's still mandatory to CE mark in the UK. It's voluntary for the rest of us to say that's most passive fire products through the EOTA route. Now, there's 3 significant changes coming in this field. We don't know whether the Brexit deal will affect the CE marking of products in the UK after the end of December. The EU is still reviewing its CPR review, and there's the James Elliott case ongoing. So we know that the Commission says there's no new hens for the foreseeable future, and we actually know that the Commission is considering taking the whole process in-house away from SEN and EOTA, which there may be pluses and minuses with that. It's certainly a significant threat, but it could actually give us an opportunity. And the UK government's proposing further legislation on products as part of the Building Safety Bill, which we've just touched on that, and we'll go into a bit more detail of that in a minute. So the first thing that happens is probably actually comes into pass, and we know is the 31st of December. We get to the end of the year, and the Brexit deal comes along. We've been told, Michael Gove said there's no extension on the 28th of April. We keep hearing that. Even in spite of the coronavirus, and think that the trade negotiation is running slowly. Those of you who studied the advice on no deal preparation 18 months ago, that advice was all withdrawn in January and hasn't yet been replaced on the government website. But actually the default position within the laws as the Brexit deals as passed is if there's nothing else happens between now and the 31st of December, then UK CA marking would replace CE marking. And as I say, there isn't necessarily a whole deal of time left for something else to come back in its place. And so so we can see that there's a potential for that coming. And we can see that there's a difference in the way that the UK and the EU are looking at this in terms of CE marking, the likelihood of CE marking. We were told earlier this week that the UK was offering Europe a transition period where European goods could come into the UK after the 31st of December in the event of no deal. We do accept CE marks. And we initially 18 months ago, we were told that will exist for years. Earlier on this week, I was told that years is not the right thing. That will only maybe exist for months. So there's a subtle change, and there seem to be that the UK government is seeking a regulatory divergence from the EU, and that's probably going to increase the likelihood of no deal, and that the amount of CE marking stuff coming into the country is going to change early mid next year. And so this is the last thing to happen, and I think, to be honest, it's probably going to be irrelevant as far as we're concerned anyway. But we know that the EC review of of construction products regulations over in Europe is taking years to come to fruition. The whole process of mandates and harmonisation of product standards is being held up. There's no new mandates. Those that exist, the harmonised standards are being held up. Product standards, if the Commission takes this whole process in-house, product standards would need to be developed by member state government-appointed representatives. We don't think, from conversations that various people have had, governments haven't got the skills, so maybe would need to ask industry for help with that. So there's maybe an opportunity in there, but I don't know. This is taking so long to come to fruition, and they tell us this is going to take years to happen. So I'm thinking that's probably not going to affect us because Brexit will have been done long since. And therefore, we come back to this new UK construction products regulation, which we see is going to come in the UK Building Safety Bill. And what we see is that, again, the government here is considering this, and this I will caveat this slide with the fact that this is very much work in progress, and I sought permission to share this, and was told yes, I could share the bold text in the middle, providing I make you aware that it is a work in progress by government. But what they're looking at is what government are looking at is they're saying in terms of construction products, where hens exist, they remain compulsory. And at the moment, there's no plans to change harmonised DN product standards. But there are proposals to bring other product families into the scope of a mandatory scheme. And what we'll have is a statutory list of what's called safety critical product families. And that text in bold there gives you a draft definition of a safety critical product or product family. So in terms of PFP and ASFP members, for our products, at the moment we are on the voluntary EOTA route. Our product standards are voluntary. But this new UK route would be a mandatory route where you would need to put in place the necessary steps to demonstrate conformity of your product in terms of product testing and conformity processes. And beyond that, actually, what's going to happen with non-listed families, so items that are not identified as safety critical, is that they will fall under a thing called the General Product Safety Regulations, and that's actually a bit of consumer law that's out there, and there's been an interest in that recently, which covers the installation of materials that they need to be manufactured and installed in a safe way. Well, that's existed since 2005. So there's an act there that's certainly worth familiarising yourself with. Okay, how would these new construction products regulations work? Well, we know that BSI is going to be responsible for developing appropriate test standards and product standards, and is going to need significant help. The product standards is going to include a similar list of essential characteristics of CE marking. So how do you test it? What's the durability of it? How do you determine that? How do you do the ongoing factory production control to demonstrate that it's the same? What audit testing will you need to demonstrate that your product remains performing the same? And from our standpoint, we're still working on this as a policy, but we think that we hope that the product standards will continue to be underpinned by the existing BSEN test standards, and obviously the logic for that would be a twofold. I mean, one, it's test once to assess twice for UK and Europe, and it would be a preferential to having to test twice. And secondly, of course, all the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds that have been spent using these existing products, these existing test standards remains valid, so that we aren't going to throw a load of data out because it's done to the European test standards. So we get to that point, and then once a product family has been written on a list by the Secretary of State, we have an agreed implementation period, at the end of which some sort of conformity marking, and I'm guessing that will probably be UKCA, marking will be mandatory. There's a few more bits and pieces just before I finish off. Also coming soon, we see a 5-year review of building regulations, and that having done the clarification exercise, what we want to get to is a 5-year review of it to get towards a digital document that covers all requirements. So it's intelligent, searchable. You can go into it and press stairs, and it will give you all the codes that apply to a staircase. It will be underpinned by a headline building regulations manual, and there's an awful lot of different areas that are going to be technically reviewed before that gets published, and from our standpoint, it did include compartmentation and fire resistance, and it included a classification of external wall constructions and possibly smoke and toxicity. So those are some fairly big subjects that are going to get covered. One final topic before I finish, and again, Colin's already talked about this afternoon. A very simple construction process which I put together, specify design, construction products are manufactured, everything's installed, it's inspected. I suppose I could have continued to use, maintain, but and one overarching subject binds all those, which is competence. And there's been a lot of work done post-Grenfell on competence in the whole construction industry. There's been an industry response group working together on this, and under the auspices of Build UK, the Construction Industries Council, and the Construction Products Association. And there's a final report, there's an interim report out already, raising the bar, that came out last year. The final report is due out in summer, and we expect to see government taking a higher profile role in implementing competence steering groups. We know that BSI has agreed with the Ministry of Housing, Community and Local Government to publish a whole new suite of competency standards as PASs, as public available specs, and that will affect anyone at any stage of the construction process, including anyone handling construction products. So there's a whole thing to consider. There was a recent BSI town hall meeting where this slide was put up that explains some of the complexities of how all this will work together, including the government sitting on this new Building Safety Competence Committee, and the HSE over here as the regulator, and the register of qualified individuals, and how we upskill the people in terms of the people working in construction industry. And there's never been a better time for it, as Colin says. Government's recently asked us a question about how far away are we from having enough competent people to work on high-risk buildings? What are the timescale? What are the costs? And of course, whether COVID-19 will affect this. And we don't know the full outcomes of the competence scheme yet, but we gave some feedback as best we can. Construction regulator is going to want to see some proof of competence underpinned by some form of training. So there's an awful lot that's going to have to be done. Obviously, what we don't know is the effects of COVID on training, and whether people will be able to deliver training, and whether people will be able to afford that training to deliver competence. And that's it from me. Basically, there's obviously, this is all a very, very rapidly evolving day. More detail on the building safety rules coming soon. We're expecting text of that out, its second reading at some point in summer. But as we said, it's going to have a significant impact on high-risk buildings and new high-risk buildings. A whole lot of work to be done demonstrating competence, and there's going to be a whole lot of new stuff for safety critical products used in construction. I ended up with Dame Judith Hackett's mantra, which she was echoing at the recent webinars, which is basically, don't wait for these regulations to come, do the right thing now. You know, we know these safety cases are coming, and just because it hasn't arrived yet, at some point, buildings to being built today will need a safety case. And so that's there's some important things that we need to get right now in advance of the regulations. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening, I hope.
Many thanks, Andrew. That was quite incredible, quite extensive, I think, and valuable insight into the current position on regulatory developments and how the landscape, I think, may form around this subject. Should point out as well that similar to the FIA, that we're always, we're really proud to be working with FIA and ASFP on FIREX, because once again, there's emphasis on competency all the time. You know, ASFP companies, manufacturers, installers are all third-party approved. So they basically do what they say on the tin, which is fantastic to know. As an onlooker, you can be assured that, you know, that the stuff is safe. It's gone through testing. It's been approved. It goes to standards. It's really, really, really fantastic. The point that stood out really on that one was, I think, Andrew, was the introduction of the UK Building Safety Bill and the UK Fire Safety Bill. I think that's going to be hugely important moving forward. And also the new National Building Safety Regulation is hugely important. And finally, the EU's review of CPR. And tethered to that, of course, is the thorny subject of Brexit. So now we'll move on to today's Q&A. Just before we do, please could you direct your attention to our webinar survey, which is accessed via the button on the row controls at the bottom of your screen. Many thanks in advance for filling out the feedback form, as this survey allows us to refine and further develop our webinar propositions in the future. So now on to the Q&A. Please direct, now onto the Q&A portion of our event. As a reminder, to participate in the Q&A, just type in your question into the text box located to the right of the presentation window, or click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If we're not able to answer all the submitted questions during today's webinar, we'll be sure to share them with our speakers who can reply to you offline after this event. And as we've seen already, there's been quite a few coming in. The one thing I just want to point out as well is that Colin is actually an expert witness in the ongoing Grenfell inquiry. So Colin, it's right to say that you can only really comment on issues that are post-Grenfell. Is that correct? Could you clarify?
Yes, or anything that's in the public arena, yeah.
Okay, many thanks for that. So if we can kick off, the first question here, Colin, is for you actually. It's quite wide-ranging. But do you think that the government can introduce the proposed expansion of fire safety enforcement and duties using the Regulatory Reform Order when the RRO emanates from the Deregulation Act?
You mean, I take it the question is it actually legal to do what they're doing? Is that the question?
It would appear so, yeah.
It's more a question for lawyers. I imagine if it were genuinely clarification, I imagine that you can do amendments to clarify something. I think there are all sorts of obstacles to an extension of scope, which is presumably why the extension of scope has adopted the mantle of clarification.
Fine, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Obviously, if it goes into a legal situation, it's quite difficult to comment. Question for Andy. Andy, do you know who is likely to be responsible for retrospective work on in-scope buildings? I.e., the building owner is obvious, but what if you can prove the building did not comply with the building regs enforced at the time of build? Is the developer still around going to have to take some responsibility?
And again, I'll use Colin's line. I'm not entirely sure about that. I would imagine you probably need to consult a lawyer. My concern with that would be, can most building owners confirm that how their building was constructed at the time it was completed? Have they got good enough records that explain what was in the building when it was completed? I would have thought more people are going to fall foul of it at that sort of a question. Their existing regulation, the 8 information is absent, lacking, etc., etc. But if they had, it would be an interesting test case, I think, that one.
Yeah, certainly. Question for Colin. Very quickly, Colin, is the FIA guidance publicly available only to FIA members?
No, it will be available on the FIA website as most, if not all, FIA guidance documents on specific issues. They appear on the website and are available to everyone, and this will be publicly available. It won't only be for members.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And with regard to the new FIA guidance on external walls, if these are to be removed from the fire risk assessments, who would you say would be accountable? Will there be recommendations on competency and third-party approved products?
I mean, the guidance note doesn't duck the issue, but it basically recommends that you make sure that whoever does this, as we see it, separate exercise, is competent. And what the guidance note will direct people to is a number of areas that this other person, if I can call them that, will need to answer, and the matters that they'll need to consider. Now, that information is entirely consistent with the guidance in the MHCLG/expert panel consolidated advice note. At the moment, of course, there is no defined competence for such a person, which comes back to discussions are going on right at this moment about a publicly available specification. And one task, and it's not, I don't underestimate how big a task, but one task, if there were a publicly available specification, was not just how to do it, but who is competent to do it, because there is a need for definition of competence, as there is for fire risk assessors.
Excellent, which actually leads me on to a really good question following up. On the issue of fire risk assessors, it says here they often miss fundamental issues surrounding fire doors, singled out for detrimentally affecting the building performance in certain issues. Specialist training can be provided but not called for. Recognition of a national training scheme in specialist sections of passive fire protection is essential. And do you have any insight or agree with this?
Certainly fire doors are really important. If you do a fire risk assessment for a block of flats, looking at the fire doors is probably 80% of what the fire risk assessor needs to worry about, because they are critical to the protection of the common parts. I'm somewhat disappointed that whoever asked the question feels fire risk assessors do miss that. I mean, I think you may be right that sometimes the doors are not given the prominence they ought to, but I think it's just one of the many things that a fire risk assessor needs a certain level of competence in. And like in anything else, if the fire alarm system in an office building is suspect, the risk assessor will have a certain knowledge of fire alarm systems. But it will direct people towards a fire alarm specialist. It may be, in some cases, you need to direct people towards a door specialist if you've got old doors and the fire resistance is totally indeterminate.
Brilliant, thank you. Question for Andy here. Are there set templates being developed for fire safety cases for consistency across the industry? If they exist, where may they be found? So far, people have searched and only found the gas industry, which is an interesting point.
No, that's a really interesting comment. And the answer is no. At the moment, there aren't templates because this is very, very new. And one of the things that we need to do is work with HSE to help them out. And yes, that's actually a really interesting area of work that we need to work with them to make sure that the pro formas that they come up with work. So that's I've just written that one down on me today. Thank you very much. That was a really useful comment. I'll get back to you as and when.
If I could just support the question and Andrew's answer, we've seen people having a go at doing it themselves, and their idea as to what will be required is like all over the place. I've seen one attempt at what they think will be required, and it's 1 page of A4. I've seen another one that is like a 15-page fire strategy. So people will need quite definitive guidance, and possibly a template would be really helpful. That's a really good question.
Brilliant, thank you. And this is for both of you as well. It's quite a wide-ranging one. It's what impact do you think the insurance industry is having on fire risk assessments moving forward?
What impact is the insurance industry having? Probably restricting it, to be honest, because professional indemnity, I'm not sure whether the question arises from property insurance or professional indemnity, but the big issue for fire risk assessors is professional indemnity insurance. The professional indemnity insurers are becoming more and more restrictive. Some are pulling out of insuring fire risk assessors at all. Some are excluding external wall construction from cover, which means they will be uncovered for any advice they've given ever in the past on external wall construction. And it is causing a problem for people and could well restrict the availability of fire risk assessors. and is liable to put the price up because insurance premiums. One of our friendly competitors has had an increase in professional indemnity insurance rates of a factor of 7. It very quickly, in terms of property protection, I suspect there's also an influence because the insurers are kind of adopting an approach that forget all this limited combustibility and forget all the ifs and buts. Let's just have non-combustible cladding on buildings. And so they are becoming a bit more restrictive in that respect, going beyond even the requirements of building regulations at the time the building was built.
Superb. This is for Andy. How do you think liability of product manufacturers will be positioned in construction products?
I mean, that's a good question, and one that's coming. I mean, at the moment, what I would turn around is say that look, the vast majority of manufacturers have some sort of third-party certification. Would always advise you to use a third-party certificated product, and the liability sits with the manufacturer, but of course they've got all sorts of things underpinning them to prove that they're doing it right. So you've got the idea that the manufacturer should be getting it right. I'm struggling with the other area, I suppose, where manufacturers may well have issue is if they start taking design responsibility, and this is one where we're working quite hard at the moment, because really, does a manufacturer take some form of design responsibility if they make a technical evaluation of their product's performance? And that's an area where manufacturers need to pay attention.
Excellent. Colin, do you have a view on that?
Sorry?
More Andrew's field, really.
Right. Excellent.
Not sure I've understood that question.
It was more, I think, more about the product liability from the manufacturer's point of view. So where do they fit in? Moving on, Colin. This is a very interesting one that comes up all the time. Would you agree that the installation of automatic fire suppression systems in apartments would greatly reduce the risks?
Oh, there's no question of that. Automatic fire suppression is like the braces that go with the belt. So if you're not very sure about compartmentation, and let's face it, with modern construction, we are not very sure about compartmentation. And there are two ways to limit fire development. One is passive, which I always see as the primary means of preventing fire spread in the form of compartmentation. But the second is active, and that is suppression. Suppression is incredibly effective. Sprinklers are particularly incredibly effective in preventing fire spread. Not necessarily protecting an individual who's directly involved in the fire. And quite a lot of people who die in fire are vulnerable people directly involved in the fire. And I wouldn't guarantee that sprinklers would save them, but they're certainly a very good... They work very well in conjunction with compartmentation. And of course, the MHCLG are talking about reducing heights for the trigger height. Scotland, I think probably quite a lot of people know, but if they don't, Scotland from 2021 will require that all new blocks of flats are sprinklered. There won't be a trigger height anymore. It will be all blocks of flats. So these are all very positive things for the future.
Can I just add on? That one of the things there's some work I've just been doing recently on sprinklers and passives, and in many ways in blocks of flats, etc. Actually, sprinklers and passive are complementary technologies. So you get the sprinkler's going to have a big effect and prevent the fire maybe from leaving the compartment of origin, but the passive is needed as much to protect the smoke and toxicity from moving backwards and forwards within the building. And so there is a series that the two need to work hand in hand to make sure that you get the best possible outcome.
Yeah, sorry, just for avoidance of doubt, I agree entirely with that. I wasn't suggesting we could get rid of Andrew's member company's passive fire protection by chucking sprinklers in. I would agree. I think the good way of describing it is indeed that they're complementary.
Absolutely. I think it's something that we've seen in FIREX over the years, is that this holistic approach between active and passive, working very, very well together. So yeah, it seems to be the best option for that. Moving on, Andrew, this is probably in your ballpark. How do you guys see the future of construction will go in the new world, especially modular timber frame and cross-laminate timber, especially for taller buildings?
It's a really good question. I did a webinar recently. Was talking to a couple of people from various fire and rescue services, and they used the terminology that what we should be doing was building things out of things that burned less, use less burny stuff. It's a really good question in terms of, will there be less cross-laminate timber and this drive to sustainable building materials, and that's an argument that's probably going to be. I'm trying to work out what the right word is. I don't think it's necessarily fought over, but there is going to be an awful lot of discussion between the poles of environmental and sustainability that says timber's a useful thing to use. At the same time, the fire safety saying, well, we don't want to use burnable stuff. We don't want to use combustible stuff. And that's something that we've got to get round, and there's a whole host of big high-level research into the effect of those and mitigation of if you build out of cross-laminate timber and then but appropriately fire suppress it with sprinklers and make it safe. That's a whole series of things that as an industry we need to work on. Maybe we need to do more of that together than we've done in the past, so that we don't just have the sustainable people looking at timber frames and showing how much more sustainable this is without necessarily considering the fire side of it, and we look at it as a more rounded industry.
So it's entirely balanced, really, isn't it? Excellent, thank you. You both mentioned prescription. Colin, if I can name this one at you, will a move towards prescription stifle innovation and hamper the introduction of new approaches that could potentially improve fire safety? Does the industry have systems and processes in place to adequately test new approaches / products?
I think if there is a move towards prescription, and it worries me that we see the beginnings of that, certainly in England, then it would absolutely stifle innovation. We need to go back to why the building regulations were first cast in functional form, because prescriptive building regulations undoubtedly stifled innovation and really created enormous bureaucracy if you wanted to do anything from anything different than the prescribed solution. So I would hope that things will not go too far towards prescription. And it certainly wouldn't be a good thing. And I think the industry can work. I like on Andrew's last point. I really liked his use of the word together, because I've been in fire safety for 45 years, and it just seems constantly that we suddenly wake up one morning and find out something is happening, and probably has been happening for the past 2 or 3 years in construction, and we've never noticed it. And I think working together and looking at the whole thing holistically and making sure that the design is fire safe and the construction is fire safe, that's the important thing. So I would hope that a move to prescription will not happen to a much greater extent than is already beginning to happen. And Dame Judith was not really in favour of prescription. I think that's worth remembering. She didn't actually favour going back to prescription.
Excellent, thank you very much. So, Andy, this would be one for you. In addition to height, what other aspect may be part of designing an in-scope building?
Well, for me, the obvious one is, can can residents evacuate easily? You are think about hospitals, think about sheltered housing, where you may well have people that can't get out as can't evacuate the building as easily as able-bodied people. There's a much greater degree of risk. So that's the obvious first level, and then of course beyond that, what's the risk of fire? What functions are being undertaken within the building? Is there something that gives you a greater risk of fire within a particular compartment?
Yeah. Does it also, would then it spill out into like the occupancy, the demographic, all that sort of thing as well, the architecture?
Yes.
All of the above.
Flicking through having a look through the questions there, I've seen a question from a comment from Simon Ince, who's mentioned the Beechmere care home in Crewe, and that's one that when you think about that, the whole building was lost. So you've got 150 people there that would have been awkward to get out, and of course then they've people the emotional response of them being homeless and having lost their possessions, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Colin,
I was just going to add to that. It's actually a very big question, and I'm going to be contentious and challenge the idea that high-rise is actually high risk in the first place. People seem to have forgotten that after Lakanal House, the Chief Fire Officers Association in one of their straplines said high-rise is not high risk. Now, were they completely wrong? And I don't think they were. Statistically, once you have the fire, you're more likely to have a death in a bungalow than a high-rise block of flats. And that's nothing to do with the architecture of bungalows. It's about the demographics of people who actually live in bungalows, who tend to be older people who are inherently at greater risk from fire because of their age. It's kind of worth remembering that the largest loss of life in any single fire between King's Cross and Grenfell was actually a fire at a care home in which 14 elderly and infirm people died. And I have to say, I will say this about Grenfell, it came from left field. All of us thought that the next big loss of life would be a care home or supported living for vulnerable people. We never envisaged it actually happening in a high-rise block of flats. And I think it would be wrong to take our eye off the ball of other buildings probably being of much greater risk. And I would include particularly supported housing for vulnerable people. That might be a two-storey house, but there is probably greater risk to those occupants, and they probably need as much, if not more, attention, and the attention is more difficult to give than in a high-rise block of flats.
Absolutely. And on that subject, there's a question that links to it. Is anybody lobbying in England for a second stair court, especially in taller buildings?
Who are you directing that at?
Either.
Well, certainly not me. I lobbied the minister. I lobbied the minister in Scotland not to have a second staircase, and gave all sorts of technical arguments. And he said, "Thank you very much for all these technical arguments. This is a political decision." I don't think he thought there was anything wrong with saying that. We tend to regard a political decision as a bit of a pejorative term, but it was a political decision in Scotland. I think in England, in all fairness, they will take a longer and harder look at the question of the number of staircases that are necessary.
Brilliant. And on that note, I think that's we're coming up to 4 o'clock, so we'll have to wrap up today. There are a load more questions, and as we said, we will get back to the questioners offline with everything you've had. So I just want to say many thanks, Colin and Andrew, for today. It was hugely impressive what was discussed. As we said, the subject matter is ongoing. I would argue it's probably the most important aspect of life safety and the conversation in the UK at the moment. And obviously, we know that the fire community has an ongoing commitment to just keeping people safe. And the Grenfell fire was was an example of where they're looking to put things right. So I just want to say also many thanks today to our sponsors at Baldwin Boxall and to everybody in the audience. We greatly appreciate your attention and participation. I hope you found it valuable. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive a personalised follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Please feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not have been available to listen to this event. So on behalf of our speakers, thank you very much, Colin. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, Andrew. Good afternoon as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I'm Jerry Dunphy from FIREX International. Many, many thanks for your time. Have a great day, everyone, and please stay safe. Thank you very much.